Hello and welcome to the Brain Matters podcast, brought to you by the Florey Institute, Australia's largest brain research centre. I'm your host, Dr Shane Huntington, and together we'll be exploring the fascinating world of brain health. We'll meet leading doctors and researchers and learn about the reality of a range of brain and mental health conditions from people with lived experience and their carers. In this episode, we'll be exploring how plastics affect the brain. The use of plastic has skyrocketed in the last century, and there's growing evidence that plastic is having a negative impact on brain development in children. We'll explore some of the effects of our environment on the brain, look at what's happening at a biological level, and ask how we can reduce the impact of plastics. Joining me today to discuss this important area will be Professor Anne-Louise Ponsonby, an epidemiologist and public health physician with the Florey. Anne-Louise leads a team of researchers who are focused on studying plastic exposure and brain disease. And she's particularly interested in understanding whether exposure to plastics while still in the womb can influence a child's neurodevelopment. We'll also be speaking to Dr Christos Symeonides, who, for part of the week, works as a general and developmental paediatrician here in Melbourne, and for the remainder of the week is a clinical and research principal with the Minderoo Foundation. Christos is working with other scientists and technical experts from around the world on the UN Global Plastics Treaty, which aims to meaningfully address the global human health impacts of plastics. Christos, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Anne-Louise, welcome.
Thank you.
Christos, I'm going to start with you because you're heavily involved in what's happening globally. We're going to get to plastics, but environmentally, there are a lot of different chemicals that are impacting us. If we sort of start at, the top level, what are some of the examples of things we should be worried about? I mean, I grew up worrying about asbestos. What are all the other things that are impacting us at the moment?
Yeah, taking a huge step back, I think we can probably break down the problematic chemicals that we've put out into the environment into those that stay there and those that break down. And if we think about those that stay there, a big group of those is what we call the persistent organic pollutants. And here are chemicals that you may or may not be familiar with, and if you are, it's probably only with their abbreviation. So people talk about PCBs, they talk about PBDs, they talk about
PFAS.
PFAS is a great example there. And these are chemicals that are regulated globally under something called the Stockholm Convention, and pretty effectively too. Countries agree to come together to choose some of the most dangerous chemicals and choose we can't be putting these out in the environment because they then stay in the environment. They are typically chemicals that are uptaken by the fauna that are around in the environment, bioaccumulated in a particular species, biomagnified up the food chain, and come back to us as top predators. And so these are a group of chemicals where there's been a feeling that no level is safe. And we can see that we can have effective global action. You mentioned asbestos. We don't have effective global action on asbestos. We have great local action on asbestos in Australia, but it got mired in the Rotterdam Convention, and that didn't get up to being strong global action. And we still have to be careful in Australia about importing asbestos in products and articles that are coming into us. And another chemical that people are very familiar with is lead. Lead, we've had global action that's been incredibly effective, removing it from paint, removing it from petrol. We could be doing more, and Australia in particular could be doing more. We're probably lagging behind a lot of other developed countries in our high exposure populations, such as in Port Pirie and in Mount Isa. And we're seeing children exposed to levels of lead with no neurological effects.
So with no neurological effects, you said?
The evidence in lead is interesting. It reflects where we are with a number of other chemicals, in that we don't have an established safe level. But we do have widespread agreement about causation of neurological effects from their marker level of 10 and probably from a level of 5 as well. There we have broad global agreement, but our own NHMRC review is hanging back a little bit on that.
Right, interesting. Now, Anne-Louise, you're an epidemiologist, so you look at this on the grand sort of scale of populations and so forth. I mean, before we get to plastics, what sort of things stand out as environmental chemical exposures that we have that are problematic?
Yeah, well, at the broad scale, epidemiology is looking at the distribution and determinants of disease at the population level. Most people are most familiar with acute infection disease epidemiologists because they really came to the fore in COVID or on the news, etc. But there's another area, which is more the area I work in, which is chronic disease epidemiology. And there the epidemics tend to roll out over decades. And we see increases in certain disorders over time and some of the others going down. For example, food allergy more recently has become more common. Sudden infant death syndrome, which I started working on, has now become less common. And, of course, one of the areas of interest is autism and attention deficit disorder, which appear to have become more common. There's a lot of qualifiers we can talk on in relation to that. And the thing is, when something increases over 2 years, it's highly unlikely to be genetic. So you have to look at modern environmental drivers and understand what could be candidates in that area.
And in terms of, as I say, before we get to plastics, are there other things in the environment that are being linked to, for example, increase in allergies and our response to certain, even things like pollen, that seems to be a lot more, maybe there's more pollen in the air, I'm not sure, but there seems to be a lot more of that than when I grew up, many decades ago. Or are we just getting better at identifying those conditions? Where do we sit with the other contaminants?
Well, there's a lot of interest in just immunoinflammatory disorders in a group, which is a very big group, and several of those seem to be going up over time. So there may be common things that are upregulating inflammation early on in life and having an effect across a range of disease outcomes. It's not like each of these diseases has different causes. So there's that entity. But to go into the other factors, there certainly are a range of other factors, but the plastics are very interesting because they actually tie into issues of nutrition, processed food. A lot of the things coming in, whether we inhale them, have them on our skin, or ingest them, we have to think of plastic chemical contributions to those. So a lot of the exposures, no matter what the modality, now potentially have a plastic issue to be considered.
Yeah. So I think it's a good time, Christos, for us to unpack the plastic scenario a bit, because I think the term people are probably used to hearing is microplastics. Like that's the one that's everywhere at the moment. I remember 10 years ago we were just saying plastics. Now we're saying microplastics. I guess things break down and they get smaller over time. But first of all, can you pull apart the plastics issue from the point of view of the plastic itself, so the polymer itself, the materials used around that to make it do what we want, and then things like, colouring and coating and, branding and other things that are often attached to plastics as well? Like what are those three parts?
So plastic we have to think of when we think about modern conventional high-volume plastics as a complex mixture which has gone through steps of production, starting with the fossil fuel origin, extracted, cracked down to very basic molecules, which then form monomers, which are the building blocks of plastics. You attach those monomers together in a step called polymerization, and you've got a polymer, which is a long chain chemical. And these tend to give the structural integrity of a plastic material, but they don't equal the plastic material. So one way of thinking about plastics is a bit, if you think about spaghetti bolognese. Now, if you think about spaghetti bolognese, in this comparison, the plastic is the spaghetti itself, the pasta, those long threads of pasta that are giving the main bulk of your meal sitting there. But you wouldn't eat that pasta on its own. There are ways that we've changed the overall meal to fit with what we want to do. And in the same way, we change what the polymer does by giving additives to it for it to give particular purposes. Some common ways in which we change a polymer, change a plastic, is with plasticizers, with colorants, with stabilizers, with flame retardants. I'll just give a couple of examples. So with plasticizers, imagine all of these four first as being your bolognese that's going into your spaghetti. Your plasticizers are acting as a lubricant between those different strands of spaghetti. They're a bit like the oil of your sauce. It means that they don't all stick in a clump. And this makes the plastic more flexible, which has been important in certain applications of plastic, such as in films. The stabilizers allow the plastics to be more resistant, for example, to UV or heat. The colorants, we can imagine like that staining that we get of our pasta once it's in the pasta sauce. They're largely for a branding perspective. And flame retardants reflect the fact that we use plastics in a lot of applications that don't fit their physical chemical properties very well because they are extremely flammable. As of course in Melbourne, we're particularly familiar with around issues about flammable cladding on building, where it was the plastic component of the building that was causing the problem. So if we think about plastics, we have to be thinking about the polymers and we have to think about the other stuff that comes in there. And there's that group of things that are deliberately added in to give functional properties that we call additives, and another group of what we call non-intentionally added substances. This may be impurities or side products of the chemical reactions or contaminants that have come along the way or breakdown products. And in the end, we're left with a complex cocktail in our plastic. Now, when people then talk about micro and nanoplastic, they're talking about size. But we're still talking about the whole spaghetti.
Yep.
So whether we're having a full meal or whether we just have a forkful in a microplastic, we're still getting the polymer plus the additives plus the non-intentionally added substances.
Now, when I think of that cocktail of various things, what I'm curious about is presumably all of those various components break down in different ways and at different speeds. How much thought is going into monitoring that? Because presumably, when I go and I know there's been research that's come out that's indicated we can find microplastics in rain. Am I seeing all the components, or is it just the long chain polymer part? Or what's the scenario there in terms of the longevity and the way in which that all breaks down into the environment?
You've nailed why I am most interested about plastics amongst all industrial chemicals. So we've talked at the beginning a little bit about persistent chemicals, those that remain in the environment. Plastic, in terms of the polymer, is a persistent chemical. Yes, it does break down very, very slowly into a micro nanoplastics. It then stays in the micro nanoplastic phase for an extended period of time. We can make projections of what that might be, but we haven't had the thousands of years of plastics being around to have empirical evidence of how long they last in the environment to test those predictions. But we are talking in the hundreds, thousands of years space. And what's really important is that plastic is sitting there again as the spaghetti, but as the spaghetti bolognese, because locked in there with only slow leaching out from the meal is the bolognese sauce. And so chemicals which would not normally be persistent in the environment, chemicals which would not usually be sitting in a lightweight, buoyant material that has this incredible potential for distribution around the world in water and in air, are now sitting in a vehicle that transports them in the air, in the water, and transports them back to us as environmental contaminants.
I just want to mention that when you're looking within the human, particularly the pregnant human, even if the chemicals aren't persistent, say they have a half-life of 10 hours and they're cleared every day, if a person's being exposed every day and there's just a particular 6-week window of vulnerability for the baby development, then the fact that it's non-persistent and totally eradicated by the body every day it does not remove potential toxicological effects.
Yeah, it's kind of like not worrying about sunburn because there's nighttime. like if we're still exposed every day, we're still going to end up with skin cancer, through protracted exposure. So,
and I think I might just pick up on what Anne-Louise said. It's a really important point. There's a double whammy exposure for a group of chemicals, and these are the group of chemicals from plastics that are migrating from the plastic during the use phase, as well as sitting in the plastic as an environmental contaminant after it's become waste. And in this use phase, such as the packaging we use for our food or the tubing that we use for processing and transporting the food, we've got that continuous exposure to a chemical that is now outside of the plastic, but with repeated exposure day to day, so that we're still getting these continuous exposures. But we then are experiencing exposure to that chemical again when the plastic hits the waste phase and is coming back to us as micro and nanoplastics.
So, Anne-Louise, when we then think about the human body, and before we get to, during gestation and so forth, but the human body in general, like I'm exposed to this in, as Christos said, two ways. One is through the direct use. I heat something up in a plastic vessel in my microwave, or I drink out of a plastic bottle, some water, and I'm getting the environmental push because I just drank out of a tap and there's microplastics in the water as well. What is the scenario with the human body there? Like, where is it going in my body when I absorb that, ingest it, and presumably to some degree breathe it in even in some sense?
Yeah, well, indeed. So our papers have shown that plastics can come in from ingestion, and there's lots of studies to say heat and co-combination with fats is adverse for that, but also inhalation or absorbed through skin with cosmetics, hair products and various things, even in homes that use a lot of household chemicals and so on, some plastics can come in through there. So it's coming in through various sources. And then it's metabolised in the liver and the kidney. But a key point is that some of these chemicals are lipophilic, so they're attracted to the lipid structures in the body. And, of course, the brain is one of the very lipid-rich structures. More than half the brain weight is actually lipids. And Christos might want to continue this point.
I think that we have to think again about our plastic in terms of our polymers and in terms of our plastic chemicals as we think about our exposure pathways. I think certainly for the particles, so the two combined together, our estimates are largely that we've probably seen a similar kind of volume or weight, same order of magnitude between what we're inhaling versus what we're ingesting. Then there's the uptake, and this is different for the two, the particles for the chemicals. I think maybe we start with the chemicals first. And Anne-Louise's point about the lipophilic nature of these chemicals is really important because this is largely why they're in the plastic in the first place. The plastic itself is lipophilic, so that is fat-loving or water-hating. And this means that it doesn't have these sort of strong charges on it, which is what distinguishes things that like being in water versus things that like being in fat. So the additives that are put into plastics, a lot of them are lipophilic too because they will sit there comfortably. That's where they want to sit. When they then are released from the body, it doesn't matter whether that came as a particle and we're absorbing it over our gut or whether it has come released into our food from some packaging and absorbing over its gut. The particle itself is not needing to cross over the gut, it's the chemical itself. And we tend in our body to have systems that are very good for blocking chemicals that have charge on them, but not so good at blocking chemicals that are lipophilic because the chemistry of our own cells are that they're covered in fat. And so it's very much seen as part of us and can transfer more easily through our bodies. And additionally, it can then sit within our bodies. And it's only through a process of metabolism, which generally increases the charge of a chemical, which then makes it more amenable to being in water, which then means that it can get out into our urine, which is how we get rid of chemicals. So the fact that these chemicals are lipophilic is really important. The fact that the brain has such a huge percentage of fat is important as a likely target organ for some of these chemicals. And even separate to that, we have to understand that a chemical does not need to get to the brain to necessarily have an effect on the brain. If we think about pathways such as Anne-Louise has been discussing about the inflammatory status of the body, where we can be setting off a chain in the system which has downstream effects on how the brain functions, but is really affecting the system as a whole.
Yeah, interesting. Anne-Louise, one of the things that I think is, the two or three most complex aspects of humanity is A, reproduction, B, our immune system, and 3, how the brain works. And I think if you beyond that, there's some other stuff that's complicated. I mean, the heart's complicated. That gives us some credit for that. But these are really interconnected, and they certainly play on one another, especially during pregnancy. There's big changes in the immune system, big changes in the way our brains are operating, all sorts of things. Your career is about looking at how the effects of environment and so forth impact some of the health as people go through pregnancy and childbirth. What are we seeing in terms of plastics contamination? Are you able to draw together some connectivity there between exposure of the parent and the child in the womb at that point, or is there that disconnect? I used to love the blood-brain barrier, but with plastics it doesn't seem to really be there as much. What's the scenario with children?
Well, I've got 2 points. I'll probably come to the umbrella review for you in a minute, Christos. But firstly, you're right, multiple body systems are affected and they are connected. So say you take something like the hypothalamus in the brain. If that gets inflamed, it affects how hormones are released, how neurotransmitters are released, what happens to our nervous system and blood pressure, for example. And that is one thing that has been shown to be some of the chemicals like phthalates can relate to that. So it does cause multi-system effects. So in medicine, many of our specialists work system by system, which works really well from a disease point of view. But when you're here in an exposure point of view, you're right, we do need to think across multiple systems. And paediatricians, of course, do think across multiple systems because they're more at a stage of life type of thing. And Christos worked across multiple systems with an important umbrella review that you did with Minderoo. Do you want to comment on that and the different body systems affected and so on?
Yes, thank you, Anne-Louise. Let me describe what an umbrella review is first. An umbrella review is the systematic review of systematic reviews. It looks out into the entire scientific literature to ask what systematic reviews have been done. In our umbrella review, we were doing a systematic review of all systematic reviews that had looked at plastic chemicals and human health outcomes, where it was looking at the kind of studies that have directly measured exposure to that chemical in some sort of biospecimen, that could be blood or urine, and have looked at a human health outcome. Let's first start with the fact that at the moment, we understand that there are around about 16,000 different chemicals used in the production of plastics.
Just 16,000?
Just 16,000.
Yeah. Okay.
16,000. Now, we found information on just 5 classes of chemicals at that level of evidence. So we're talking about only a small fraction of the chemicals that are being used that we're honing in this academic research to evaluate safety. So this is the only real-life safety data in humans that we've got. Second of all, of these 5 groups of chemicals, those groups were phthalates, which are a group of plasticizers, bisphenols, or specifically bisphenol A, which is a monomer that's used to make plastics, PBDEs, the polybrominated diphenyl ethers, which are flame retardants, PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, which were used as plasticizers and flame retardants alongside some other uses, and PFAS, which were used in the production of plastics. None of these chemicals were identified to be safe. There were multiple health impacts of each of these chemicals. And we looked and mapped that to different human systems as well, with multiple effects across those different human systems for each of these group of chemicals when we've come to have this sort of high level of evidence where there's sufficient research has been done at an academic level where that allows for there to be a systematic review, which then allows us to find it in an umbrella review.
Anne-Louise, when you look at this sort of review, some of this data coming about, how do you connect that with your work where you're looking at specifically, child health over a broad, population group? What are you seeing?
Well, we know these plastics also are likely to cause effects that are cardiovascular, respiratory, growth, adiposity. And then, of course, they're called endocrine disrupting chemicals because they have various hormone-related effects. And I think it shows the value of some of the work that we've been doing over a long time. So Christos, myself, Pete Fulham and other members in the team, we've done a population-based cohort in the Barwon region with Barwon Health, Deakin University and MCRI. And we've looked at development of multiple structures and functions in the baby, just not one outcome at a time, but a range of outcomes. It was certainly my major emphasis being at the Florey is the neurodevelopmental side, and that's Christos' specialisation, so that's his as well. But other people in our group are looking at cardiovascular, respiratory, allergy and so on. So those papers are all coming out as well.
And when you speak about the neurological, so, we're obviously part of the Florey podcast, so the brain is the thing here. And what do you see in terms of the developmental aspects of children who are clearly exposed in multiple ways, not just through, I assume, nutrients they're receiving from the mother, but also just environmental? They come in with genetic factors. What do you see in terms of the impact of plastics? Can you see it?
Yes, we can. But broadly, we realise these diseases like autism are complex and they have both genetic and environmental drivers. That's well recognised. And then they have the interaction between the gene and the environment. One way to think of it is like a car accident where the genetic, the analogy is the internal things in the person, perhaps being a drowsy driver and not having good eyesight. The external is the road, like the hairpin bend and the rain and so on. An accident often happens because these multiple factors come together to precipitate an event. And the way we approach our analyses is to investigate how these factors come together to precipitate events. So we would never say plastics is the only cause of autism, but we would say in some cases of autism, plastics appears to play a contributory role.
I think I'd like to point out the power of the approach that Anne-Louise takes. We're looking at observational associative research that is asking the question, if this group of individuals is exposed to more of a chemical than this group of individuals, this other group of individuals, do they have more of a particular health outcome? So it might be cardiovascular, but it might be a neurological outcome. It doesn't talk about how that happens. It's powerful if you get into the point of an umbrella review and a systematic review because you've got that consistency of findings across different populations, different study groups, all seeing that connection between a particular exposure and a particular outcome to start drawing a conclusion there that we think that this is a causal pathway. That is, that exposure caused the disease, not that, say, the disease caused the exposure. A second bit of information that we can use, and again, that is powerful in the research that Anne-Louise does, and in the Barwon infant study cohort, and the amazing families that contribute to that, is the timing. We're measuring exposure during the period when the baby's in the womb, and we're looking at outcomes when the baby's now a child. So the outcome has clearly fallen much later than the exposure, which gives us, again, evidence that the direction in which the causation is happening, the biological effect, is from the exposure to the outcome, not the other way. But what is particularly powerful about the kind of work that Anne-Louise has been leading is asking alongside, was the exposure statistically associated with an outcome, what biological pathway could have taken us there?
In the brain, in the womb, there's a very intricate sensitive system for how the brain develops. And it's actually a little bit different for boys compared to girls. So one of the things that happens for boys is with their higher rates of testosterone, some of the testosterone gets converted to neuroestrogen through this enzyme aromatase. So if you compare male babies halfway through pregnancy to female babies, males have a lot more of this aromatase because the aromatase has a job to do. We previously knew that in postmortems, males with ASD are more likely to have silenced aromatase in the frontal area of their brain after death compared to healthy controls. And we know also, of course, in autism that it's more common in males. So that's part of why Wachin Boone and Chris Vasey, independently of Christos and I and the biz team, got interested in this issue. So the thing with the aromatase function is how does it get activated or shut down? One of the ways is epigenetic gene switching, and that is where the activity of the gene can be shut down. Usually it's not fully silenced. It's not fully silenced or open. It's just down-regulated, and that's by a complex chemical reaction. And we showed, the lab team showed that even in cell cultures, bisphenol A down-regulated the expression of the neuronal cells with producing this aromatase. So the lab people then went through an intricate set of studies, but in the human cohorts, we were fortunate to have our Australian cohort, the Barwon Infant Study, and also the US Columbia cohort in New York. And in both those studies, the bisphenol A down-regulated this aromatase. We had additional information in the BIS cohort, and we were able to look at those males that had low or high aromatase genetically, even before the switching comes in and out. And we found the effect of plastics was more reverse. In fact, six-fold increased risk of autism in the boys that had lower aromatase. Even so, I want to stress that plastics is not the complete thing of the story, because we look at the end of our paper and how much autism could be avoided if those boys with low aromatase had totally not been exposed to plastics. It's only about 12%. So it's important, but it's more that we think this, as Christos said, this style of mechanistic work to understand cause is a very useful way to go. So, and then, of course, there are a whole set of lab studies as well that very elegantly showed aromatase was the culprit there in this particular pathway.
So it's interesting because this is one pathway, and my understanding is like 1,000 genes or something potentially involved in autism. Presumably there's 1,000 environmental conditions that also may potentially influence what happens there as well. How do you pull out correlation from causation? And I get there is a pathway that's been identified, but that doesn't equal causation. So necessarily when there's so many potential components involved, like it may be a small piece of causation, but it may be an insignificant piece. How do you
Well, we think it
that?
is a pathway of causation because we had 32 different parts of evidence triangulating that. But you're right, it's not the complete story of all the pathogenesis of autism that exists. I'd like to say that when we have these environmental and chemical things, that even though we have thousands of them, some of them act in similar ways. So one of the things we do is we try and put them into composite sets. And we're doing that more and more. So say with the genes, we might get all the genes that are in, say, an oxidative stress pathway, like Christos said, and we'll group them together and then we'll get a summary estimate for that. So that's one way, we call it, of data reduction to try and we've still got a big scope, but we're looking at summaries. And similarly, a very big effort, the Endpoint Consortium in the EU has just finished and Florey was a part of that. And one of their recommendations recommendations to the regulators, and EU is one of the world leaders, is that people should not be regulating against chemicals one at a time. We don't get exposed one at a time. We should be looking at sets that act similarly, like if they're all pro-oxidant, make up a pro-oxidant chemical score. And there's some papers that have been published with that approach, showing you actually get much more powerful estimates of harm. And when we're talking about things that might be pro-oxidant, it may not be just plastic chemicals. It may be pesticides, it may be food additives. There's all sorts of things that can contribute to these composite scores. But that's part of the way we handle it.
If I might also pick up on causation, I think that's exactly what made me so excited to be part of this research. Because what we had was parallel experimental work in the lab and observational work in humans. And to some degree, that is balancing out the limitations of each as far as we could realistically and practically ever achieve. On the human side, we of course can't expose humans deliberately to BPA and follow them up for 20 years and find out what happened to their children. We are going to be working in observational research, but we can close that gap down from looking purely at correlation to incorporating information from in the lab studies to understand the pathway. So in this cohort, first of all, in the lab, the two core things that were studied within mice was, what does it look like if we expose mice to BPA? And what does it look like to mice if we change their genes so they don't produce this aromatase at all? And the powerful finding from the lab studies is that those two groups of mice come along with the same pattern of biological differences in the brain and behavioural differences in terms of social behaviour and repetitive behaviours.
So whether it's plastic or
whether it's plastic,
standard chemical we produce,
whether it's BPA, whether they're exposed to BPA, or whether it's a strain of mice where aromatase has been knocked out and they don't produce aromatase at all,
and they both come out the same.
Yeah.
Interesting.
One thing is, it's very important to understand with diseases like autism, it's not just main effects of genes, it's also how genes make us vulnerable to what's in the environment.
Now, we're almost out of time, unfortunately, for this episode, but Christos, I didn't want to end before asking you about your work with the UN under the Minderoo Foundation's support. What's the goal there? Because when we hear all these things and we hear some of these potential impacts and so forth, and there's a lot we don't know about, we are in a world filled with plastics. That is not changing anytime soon. We may be able to avoid some of them, but we can't avoid all of them. So what's the goal of what you're doing in particular with the UN Global Plastics Treaty?
I mean, we are in a world of plastics. We produce 40 million tonnes of plastics every year. So that is our entire human body weight every year in plastic being produced. And there's 8 billion tonnes of plastic out there in the world, and we've discussed how persistent it is. The Global Plastics Treaty is looking at the issue of plastics pollution from a life cycle perspective of plastics. So that, of course, considers the pollution that's being made in production side, coming from a fossil fuel origin, the pollution that's coming in the use phase as plastic chemicals leach out, but also to some degree micro and nanoplastics, and the pollution that's happening beyond the use phase when plastic becomes waste and going out into our environment. My deep interest in the Global Plastics Treaty is that it should address the health implications of that plastic pollution. And it has been exciting to see that the negotiators coming together for the Global Plastics Treaty, what they call the INC, the International Negotiating Committee, have agreed that health is part of the goals and aims of the Global Plastics Treaty. Now we need to see steps agreed in that treaty that will address those health issues. If we're looking at the production side, we've got to look at less fossil fuels being used for making plastics. We've got to look at less plastics being used. And there's a lot of unnecessary plastics that are being used. If we're looking at the chemical side, then we've got to have a process that's going to be identifying out of those 16,000 which are the harmful chemicals, so that the plastics that we do continue to produce have safer chemicals that are in them. Not BPA, please. Not the phthalates that we've been discussing. But as we've been saying, there's a huge amount of uncertainty to it. There's a big gap of all the chemicals that aren't being studied. They're also not being reviewed adequately at the chemical management side of things. And then at the end and at the beginning, there's also the workers and the communities that have a specific health impact from plastics. So that might be occupational health exposures that are happening during these industrial processes of making plastics or in dealing with plastic waste, especially the informal waste pickers, which frankly a lot of our plastic waste, especially when we were exporting our so-called recycled plastic, was being managed. And secondly, those communities that are living in the immediate environments of those industrial facilities, which are dealing with a special set of risks around the releases and emissions that happen associated with that industry. And my work on the Global Plastics Treaty in relation to the Minderoo Foundation is really advisory and scientific process, working with other scientists and those with technical expertise in making that information available to the negotiating committee when they're understanding the nature of the problem and the kind of solutions that they can use put forward. And I'm optimistic when they come together again in August for the next step of the Global Plastics Treaty that we might see another step towards meaningful changes that will reduce the human health impacts of plastics.
Fingers crossed.
Yes, I like to think that 25 years ago we had the 1987 Montreal Protocol globally to eradicate hydrofluorocarbons to protect the ozone hole. And that actually worked, and the ozone hole has got smaller. It's supposed to be back to normal size by 2040. So we had a lot less resources than we have now, hey? And there are some good news stories out there. So I feel like it's always good to remember to be proactive, and it's fantastic having Christos Minderoo and other Australians involved in that global effort.
And there are good news stories, aren't there?
Yeah.
You know, what we did with the CFCs, what we've done with all of those chemicals we started the discussion with about persistent organic pollutants and about lead and about asbestos. We have seen that where we identify a problem, we can come together and do something about it. We have a special set of problems around plastics because of their persistence and the persistence and transport that it lends to chemicals that are in it. But we also have a set of solutions that have worked in the past that we can put to plastics as we have to those other chemicals in the past.
Christos, thank you very much for your work, and good luck with the UN. Hopefully that will, I know it's a slow process, but I hope you see good progress there when you next meet. And thanks for being part of the Florey podcast.
Thank you very much.
Anne-Louise, good luck with your ongoing work as well. And I think we all want our kids to be healthy. You've done some pretty substantial work there in the past, which has had huge benefits in the SIDS area and so forth.
I should mention my team. There's a lot of very committed people at the Florey in this team working on this issue. Thanks
so much. You've been listening to the Brain Matters podcast, brought to you by the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health. Join us for our next episode on brain health, and if you have a particular topic you would like us to cover in the future, please drop us a comment or send a message via the email in the show notes. I'm Dr. Shane Huntington. Thank you for listening.